Great. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me. And I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person, but I'm glad to have this time with you now. So as was already said, I was finishing the final revisions to my Grove book when the threat of COVID was starting to swirl. And these early months of 2020, they involved trips to the British Library to finish my research. And as I passed through King's Cross Station, I regularly walked by a BT billboard that proclaimed, "Technology will save us." And this to me seemed an irony given the topic of my book. So back then, I was quite skeptical of technology's salvific potential. And I thought of that slogan when lockdown began 2 months later. It seemed that BT's proclamation was becoming prophetic as we were quick to reimagine work, church, social life, and family via technological means. I also wondered whether I should quickly write an afterword to recount on my suggestions and encourage a full embrace of the digital. However, 2.5 years on, I remain convinced of the themes that I touched on in my Grove booklet. Specifically, the importance of the question, what does it mean to live well as a human in the digital age? It was this question that sparked my whole project. While deeply theological and spiritual in nature, I noticed that this question was the point of orientation for those writing about technology's impact in other non-theological disciplines. The consistent message was, if we do not control technology, it will control us. And what was particularly intriguing for me were the practices that these writers observed to be most efficacious to this end. While not articulated as such, if I read their work with a Christian imagination, I started to find traces of the classical spiritual discipline. And this caused me to ask, what happens if we bring this contemporary writing into conversation with a Christian understanding? How does this help us to reimagine the spiritual disciplines for a digital age? Now, where that led me can be read in my book, so I won't rehearse that here. However, what I do want to do with the time we have together is explore the themes of my book in light of contemporary developments, seeing what that might suggest as we move forward in our spiritual practice. As I said at the start of this talk, I wondered if the reality of lockdown was going to render my work moot. However, while we were stuck in this digitally mediated reality, what fascinated me was how quickly the importance of discipline emerged as necessary to living well through the pandemic. Get enough sleep, limit your news intake, exercise, eat well, express gratitude, have time away from screens. There was a clear message to do things that we've always known are good for us. But why? On one hand, discipline helped us to regain a sense of control. I have no idea what tomorrow will be like, but I can control my actions today. On the other hand, living through a pandemic has required all of us to face the fact that we are creatures, limited, vulnerable, and dependent. We don't hold the future like we thought. Theologically, whether we realized it or not, we came face to face with the truth that we are not God. Put another way, we came face to face with our humanity and all of its limitations. For us as Christians, we know that it has always been the spiritual disciplines that have helped us to live well in relation to this truth. We are dependent creatures, and we are loved by the Creator who makes, holds, and sustains all things. And the disciplines carve patterns into our lives in line with how God designed us to live. They are the trellis upon which we build our faithful Christian practice. While we seem to be on our way out of, at least, the restrictions of the pandemic, many of us now find ourselves stuck in the hybrid, navigating between the demands of the physical alongside that of the digital. We're saving time and the planet by reducing how much we have to travel, as digital technology means that distance is no longer a factor that has to be overcome. But in the gain, there is a loss. I'm a lecturer, and it wasn't until we had to shift to teaching online that I realized how much learning happens around the embodied edges. in the conversations just before or after a lecture, in the coffee queue, or in the safety of being able to articulate your ideas out loud with a trusted friend rather than an entire Zoom screen. Me presenting today over Zoom means that I can participate, but it also means that I will miss the kinds of conversations that require physical presence. Digital only is like life lived in 2 dimensions rather than 3. Physical only seems increasingly untenable if we desire to retain a particular quality of life. It seems our only option is to find a path through that holds the 2 in tension. As we navigate our way through this new hybrid reality, what I remain convinced of is the importance of embodied presence for our human flourishing. And the irony is not lost on me that I deliver that in this particular way. And in what remains of this talk, I want to explore how embodiment is key to love of neighbor. From here, we'll then explore one of the many paradoxes of the Christian life, that the way love of neighbor is cultivated is through the practice of solitude. And this is important as it is also clear that both of these, embodiment and solitude, are under threat without a disciplined digital life. How embodiment impacts how we treat others has been a subject of recent media interest. In an article titled, "Why Are People So Mean to Each Other Online?" published by the BBC, it is argued that, quote, "the internet acts like a kind of digital fueled alcohol, freeing us to say things to strangers that we would never dare to say if we met them," end quote. This is a significant statement. Without the bodily presence of another, we act differently. And in this case, we act in a way that does not honor the other. Monica Lewinsky, made famous by her affair with Bill Clinton, gave a TED Talk that suggests something similar. Using her experience as a starting point for cultural reflection, she argues that the digital, and by extension the disembodied, has created the perfect conditions for a culture of shame and public humiliation, primarily because there is no accountability for our actions. What I want to narrow in on is Lewinsky's suggestion for how we can counter this culture of shame and public humiliation. She states, quote, "We need to return to a long-held value of compassion and empathy. Online, we've got a compassion deficit, an empathy crisis. We need to communicate online with compassion, consume news with compassion, and click with compassion. Just imagine walking a mile in someone else's headline," end quote. For Lewinsky, compassion is the antidote. However, while this is a laudable suggestion, what I don't think she has sufficiently considered is the extent to which the medium itself, the digital, prevents true compassion from developing. Why? Because I suggest true compassion towards others requires embodiment. Compassion comes from the Latin and means to co-suffer. It means to enter into the place of the other, and the only way to enter into this place is to know the other. Can we be truly known without embodiment? Embodiment, physicality, brings with it a gritty reality that is particular. In the flesh, I can't be taller. While I might be able to pretend to be someone I'm not virtually, at some point in the flesh, the mask will fall away and I will be seen for who I am. If we want to make ourselves known to others, but resources like social media let us do that on our own terms. You know who I am, but you don't know me, meaning I'm not truly known. There is a Christian discipleship issue here. As Christians, we are called to lives of integrity. Our digital and physical lives should be in alignment. And this is something to reflect upon as you consider your own practice. However, turning to our interactions with others, if interaction is increasingly online at the expense of embodied interaction, there are multiple implications. As Lewinsky experienced in the digital space, it becomes easier to treat someone not as a person, but as an object for whom compassion is not deserved. It also becomes easier to ignore our responsibility towards those that suffer when they remain disembodied entities. We hear about or maybe even sign online petitions that advocate on behalf of those that are marginalized or suffer in our society. But think for a moment of how you would respond if the suffering person was in your embodied presence. How would that change and sustain your feelings of compassion towards them? While our digital selves advocate for those who need help, as those who took in Ukrainian refugees described in an article published last week, it is much harder to actually physically care for those who are suffering. It requires real sacrifice on our part. Not only is true compassion limited if engagement is only in disembodied form, but the digital medium of the internet itself also limits our capacity for compassion. The reason is because compassion requires deep thinking, something the internet prevents us from doing in its very construction. Critic Nicholas Carr states, quote, "It's not only deep thinking that requires a calm, attentive mind. It's also empathy and compassion. The experiment, say the scholars, indicates that the more distracted we become, the less able we are to experience the subtlest, most distinctively human forms of empathy, compassion, and other emotions," end quote. And how do we overcome this distraction? According to many of the secular writers I read, it is through the practice of solitude. The Desert Fathers and Mothers, while writing and living long, long before the advent of the digital age, argue a similar point. For them, solitude is necessary for compassion because it creates the space in us for compassion. It helps us to live selflessly in relation to those around us. This sentiment is carried forward into the present day. Richard Foster in Celebration of Discipline writes, quote, "The fruit of solitude is increased sensitivity and compassion for others. There is a new freedom to be with people. There is new attentiveness to their needs, new responsiveness to their hurts. Thomas Merton observes, it is in deep solitude that I find the gentleness with which I can truly love my brothers. The more solitary I am, the more affection I have for them. Solitude and silence teach me to love my brothers for what they are, not for what they say." Why is solitude so necessary? As Foster reminds us, quote, "In solitude, we are freed from our bondage to people and our inner compulsions, and we are free to love God and know compassion for others," end quote. The practice of solitude, of withdrawing to create space with God, propels us out into relationship with others. We are attentive, we are responsive, we are freed by the love of God to have compassion for another. Because of this, we have to take seriously the way technology lays claim to our capacity for solitude. Because our attention is the commodity technology is trading in, we need to be aware that technology is designed to do this in ways that extend into our subconscious and are beyond our control if we don't put moderating practices in place. What this looks like in practice is for you to discern, and you can read my book if you'd like to know what that looks like in my own life. But as I conclude, we need to be aware of how the digital puts particular pressure on certain aspects of our human existence: our time, our attention, our concentration, our physicality. Taking action to preserve these things and having the courage to resist or reject certain technologies that deny our humanity. But we also need to be aware that the physical and digital do not run on parallel tracks. Instead, this is our modern human experience. Thus, who we are online is as important as who we are in person. We need to move towards integration, seeing the physical and digital as extensions of the same human reality. and thus both in need of discipline and reform. And as we do and are transformed in our humanity by the Spirit into the image of the Son, therein lies the potential to speak prophetically into our most pressing cultural questions, have wisdom in what we adopt and reject, and love our neighbor with embodied compassion. Thank you.
Okay, Sarah, thank you very much. We have a question somebody has asked online, so I don't know if you can see it in your chat. So Richard says, very helpful and insightful. Does this mean that concepts like digital church and hybrid church are fundamentally unsustainable or second best at most?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I feel more sympathetic to the latter, to something that's hybrid, that has some sort of in-person capacity. I struggle with digital church. I struggle with something that has no physical outworking at all. And particularly because as a church, one of the things that we are called to be are those that gather around physical elements, the sacraments. And there's a physicality right at the heart of what it means to gather as Christians. So I can see more space for the hybrid, but I can't see, I personally theologically can't see how digital church is the fullest expression of who God calls us to be. But I know that others would see that, but I think something is just lost when we are not physically present. And I think Paul was don't give up the habit of meeting together. I think there was something about that included the physical. It had to, because of just who we are as human beings.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, Ian.
Sarah, thank you very much. I'm kind of guessing you're not on Facebook.
Sorry, no, I'm not on Facebook, no.
Just an observation. I mentioned on the train, in my embodied state, coming to this physical meeting on the train, I got into conversation with the person next to me, which of course doesn't happen when you're coming virtually. And I mentioned that in France, smartphones are banned in schools. Mm-hmm. And she said, yes, did you also know that it's illegal in France for an employer to send employees emails outside work hours?
Wow.
Which is quite something, isn't it?
Yeah.
But my primary question was about this whole thing about what happens with online and embodiment. So you've written a growth booklet. So when I pick up your growth booklet and I read it, I'm learning from you, but in a disembodied way. So it isn't merely the absence of the body. It isn't. I just want you stimulate me to think, what is it about engaging online, which is a particular form of disembodiment, where writing isn't the same? So, for example, why does it feel different if I write somebody a letter than if I send them an email, let alone send them a WhatsApp message?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that, I mean, of course, there is a disembodied aspect of writing, particularly as you get degrees of separation away from that person. So, you know, reading something written by someone that you don't know is going to be a different interpretive experience of reading something by someone you do know, because you'll have a different kind of context, and that context will form and shape how you read it. Now, I think the thing with letter writing is really interesting because, of course, while it is disembodied, in the sense of you get a letter in the post, there is a physicality to it because every person has their own unique handwriting. And that person has physically kind of, there's a particularity to that. Whereas, I suppose we could choose fonts and things, and I suppose you could say there's a degree of particularity there, but there is also a flattening out of that particularity, and that you don't have something that is unique just to that individual. So I think that I think it's a fair point of the question of how far what is it about the digital that is particularly challenging. And to me, it's the loss of particularity, which seems to be kind of tied to the loss of something that makes us uniquely human. And I think my area is theology and the arts, so I think it also presses into what it looks like for us to create and to make and things, and some of that ends up being not necessarily taken away, but takes a different form. I think we're also in an interesting situation where we're transitioning from generationally transitioning from those who remember life without the digital to those for whom their whole life has been constructed in the digital. And so I think we'll be asking different questions of the digital in 15 years, because you'll have people who I find with my students, my younger students, they're way more critical and able to engage well with the digital space than maybe my parents would be, because it is something that has constructed their formation as people in a way that it's not been for else. So I think we're in this transition period where I think we're actually trying to figure out what is going on and what do these different things mean and what makes them significant. And the unfortunate thing about cultural engagement is you tend to understand things after the fact, not while you're right in the midst of it.
Yes, come forward just so that Sarah can hear.
Sara, thank you for that presentation. I'll get down so you can see me.
Hello.
You said something about compassion requires deep thinking, which I'm totally accept. But then you went on to say something about, but deep thinking isn't enabled by the internet environment. And I just wonder whether you could explore that a bit more with us, because my own current experience is I work in a research establishment where a lot of my deepest thinking is actually done when I'm engaging with other people's thought on the internet. It gives me a ability to interact with people in other parts of the world, etc. Often that's then followed up, if I get really interested in that conversation, with some in-person stuff, on the phone, or I try and meet them at a conference or whatever. But I just was interested. You seem to be saying that the internet environment prevents deep thinking, and I just wonder whether you'd explore that a bit more.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's helpful. So it sounds like, actually, I think how I'm hearing you use the internet is in a way that's quite intentional and disciplined. So the internet is being sort of used as a particular tool for your own knowledge and understanding and engagement, and you're using it as a tool for deep thinking. And so I think perhaps that's a helpful nuance of what I was saying, is a helpful nuance to what I'm thinking about. I think more of where the internet, and particularly social media and particularly smartphones, pull against deep thinking, because it's designed to draw our attention. And actually what you're talking about is using the internet as a way to continue to be an information seeker. So you're going after information, but the way that technology is now designed is it pushes information at us. And that's a very different way to engage with information, because we become then taken this, and so we're no longer seeking information. We're having information pushed at us, or having notifications pop up, or we're having algorithms pushed at us that we think we're in control of, but we're not really. And so I think it becomes a question then, I think, of how we use these things well, which is, I think, why we have to see these things as two aspects of our human reality rather than as parallel tracks, because because I think what we want to get to is where the digital enhances our physical reality, but but it's learning how those two things come together well. But I think oftentimes what's happening is, if we're not thinking about technology in the way, we become the sort of the victims to those who are making decisions on our behalf. And I think then what happens in that is our attention is something that they are seeking. They need to keep us on their platforms, because that is the commodity they're trafficking in, particularly when things are free. Because if you're not paying anything, what you're paying with is your attention, particularly for apps and things. So I think it's probably fair to say it's not the internet wholly, because the internet can be used as a tool, but I think it's much of the technology that is coming out of the digital space that is pulling us away from that deep thinking. And again, I think it'd be interesting to see as, you know, as children have grown up in that environment, whether some of the abilities they need to cultivate deep thinking, which then means that they use technology in a way that is for those purposes. It'll be interesting to see whether or not some of those formative things that happen in development. The comment earlier about smartphones being banned from classrooms, I think that sort of sits behind some of that. And I know there are discussions about whether or not, you know, should there be an age limit on when children can start to have smartphones, a bit like how we now limit tobacco and alcohol, because we know we have a much clearer sense of what happens to childhood development whenever these dopamine hits happen, which is what notifications do and are. So I think we're kind of in an interesting place to see. Again, this is the generational thing. I think that for those of us who have been able to adopt the internet and digital technology, but having been formed and shaped in a different environment, we use technology differently versus those who are coming up for whom that has been the environment that has formed and shaped who they are.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. Inadvertently and unknowingly for you, it's been interesting to hear themes of embodiment and disembodiment from you in terms of digital disembodiment, and from Tim about disembodying our younger members. So that's been a really interesting cross-section to have. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing updated and new titles from you in the Growth series. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.